You hear a lot of people throw around the term tactical when talking about tabletop role-playing games. They'll say things like, D&D 4th edition was more tactical than 5th edition is, or Pathfinder 2nd edition is the most tactical of the high fantasy tabletop RPGs. But what do we really mean when we say that, and how do you go about designing a game that is tactical? Let's see if we can figure this out together. I'm hoping by the end of this video we'll have workshopped a definition, a structure that we can use to apply to existing games to determine if we think they're tactical, and a guideline that we can use when making our own games to ensure that they have meaningful tactical decisions in them. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and every week on this channel we release a new video diving into a different tabletop design subject, looking at the principles of design, different methodologies, and trying to learn from other games to make us better designers ourselves. And if that sounds interesting to you, consider hitting that subscribe button down below and turning on notifications so that every week you can be informed when we release a new video. Alright, let's dive into this meaty subject of tactical role-playing games. Before we even attempt to posit a definition of tactical, let's examine some games that everybody's familiar with outside of the tabletop role-playing game space. Checkers, chess, and Go. There's no doubt that checkers is a simpler game than chess. Chess has more rules, more nuances within those rules. Each of the pieces has different moves it can make. You know, the little horsey guy goes in the L shape. The little pawn just moves forward except when they need to take another unit, in which case they move diagonally. There's even exceptions to rules, like what is it, castling, in the bottom right corner. It's been years since I've really played chess. But there's no doubt that checkers is simpler than chess. And we would also say that chess is more tactical than checkers, right? That should be uncontroversial. It's not to say that there's no skill involved in checkers, far from it. But chess is on another level entirely, mainly as a result of the different nuances of play. There are more discrete options available in chess than there are in checkers, simply by the nature of the different moves the pieces have. So that might make us think that a game is more tactical when it has more nuanced rules, when there are more permutations of pieces, and when those pieces do different things, and when there are more considerations between which pieces to use when, beyond just board position. There's all these synergies between different pieces and how you can lock down your opponent's moves, etc., etc. But that doesn't sound right to me. Because now let's compare chess to Go. Go is even simpler than checkers as far as rules. There's really just one rule: put stone on board. That's really it. It is the simplest rules one can imagine. You can teach somebody how to play Go in just a few minutes because there's really only one move. All the stones are the same shape and size. There's not like the king stone that has different moves than the pawn stone. There's just the white stones and the black stones. But Go is way more tactical and strategic than chess is. It's on a whole nother order of magnitude there, even though its rules are even simpler. I mean, just look at the time gap between when the computers could beat the top human players in chess and when they could beat the top Go players. We're talking decades in between. So mechanical complexity isn't necessarily what creates a more tactical experience. It's not to say that it works against it, but if mechanical complexity was the sole source of tactical play, then Go would not be more tactical than chess. Now, before we switch gears into examining some tabletop role-playing games that apparently are tactical, I want to do a quick shout out to Indestructiboy's RPG, Vagabond. Now, if you're watching this channel, you probably know who Terran is and Destructiboy, and maybe have heard of his role-playing game called Vagabond. Now, he's not describing this game as tactical. He actually says compact and chewy rather than crunchy, but I'm just giving a shout out to his current Kickstarter campaign that's running right now. He's looking to do additional funding for the print run of his game, which is a fully complete game. There's quick start guides, you can download all sorts of materials. So I definitely recommend checking out that page and consider supporting him. I'm a firm believer in supporting indie developers, right? Hasbro doesn't necessarily need more of our money at this point. They don't need our shout outs and our support like indie devs do. And I think it's in the indie dev space that we're really starting to see innovation and some really great games like Vagabond. So check it out. I'll put a link down below. But to get to our definition of tactical, let's now shift into some games that do say that they offer tactical play. When I say tactical role-playing game, what comes to mind? Is it something with a grid and with all of these special abilities and stacking numerical bonuses that's very complex and erudite? Or is it something that gives you unlimited freedom without the constraints of those rules to make any tactical decisions you want contextually based on the scene? And now that I have you thinking about that, write down in 1 or 2 sentences what you think a tactical role-playing game is. What's that definition? Now that we've looked at chess, checkers, and Go, and then we'll compare it to what we come up with at the end. I think a great game to look at would be Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's often lauded as one of the most tactical fantasy role-playing games on the market, but is that well deserved? Well, let's look under the hood here. In Pathfinder, you have myriad numerical bonuses that can stack up against each other and penalties. You have a more nuanced action economy system than a lot of other tabletop role-playing games that just use a normal 1 action and movement. It also has a million different character build options, all sorts of different feats and abilities and spells, all of which create an extremely complex game. But what's interesting here is that so much of the tactical aspect of Pathfinder 2nd Edition is actually done outside of gameplay. Well, let me explain what I mean by that. Many builds in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are about optimization, that you create a build that has an ability it then uses, whether that's a spell or a feat or some other class feature, that you go all in on and create really dramatic, powerful effects. The homework takes up a significant portion of what makes that game tactical. But is that tactics? Now, all of that homework isn't tactical. That's system mastery. That is taking all of these disparate rules and features and combining them in novel and effective ways to do something really powerful. And I think that might actually work against tactical play, because the more your character focuses in on a set of powerful abilities, the fewer viable choices you would have on your turn to impact the fight. Because when it's my turn, it's going to mean that I'll have some aspects of combat or some approaches to problem solving that are going to be orders of magnitude more effective than others because of my character build, because of the way I've built myself as homework before the session even began. And so the amount of different tactical options I have has actually been reduced. I need to be pulled down to the character sheet to determine what would be most effective because of those stacking numerical bonuses. And let me give an example of what I've experienced when playing tabletop role-playing games that are described as tactical, whether that's Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or anything like that, where on a given turn, you just look at your sheet and use your most powerful ability, irrespective of what the other players are doing, because each of them are just going to look at their sheet and use their most powerful feature, spell, or ability. And there's no need to necessarily coordinate with one another, because each of you have built yourself to be that effective at this particular niche. And so there's very little decision making that you need to do on your turn, because I know I've built my evocation wizard to be able to casually fireball whenever I need to and ignore all my allies. So there's not a lot of tactical decision going there, as I've optimized myself to be that effective at this one thing. And to attempt to do any other action in the fight would contribute so much less, or have so much less impact, or be so much less effective or likely to succeed, that it would be a detriment to try it, simply because my fireballs are just that dang good. And it's that process of optimization that is still very satisfying, though. System mastery is fun and cool. I've thoroughly enjoyed over the years pouring through different splat books and expansions to try to concoct the most powerful build or the most specialized character. But that's not necessarily tactics. Now, Pathfinder 2nd Edition also has a very interesting combat engine in which there are different action points, and different actions you can do will cost a different number of points. Spells have spell casting time. There's all sorts of different branching decisions you can do during your turn in addition to that complexity. So the point I'm trying to make here is that that complexity, though, of character creation and builds doesn't necessarily increase tactical play. Those are different. We're starting to surface a definition here, I think. We're starting to work it out. So I'm going to posit a working definition that we can chew on here. Tactical role-playing games are ones in which there are myriad viable options with distinct outcomes. Let's unpack that. I feel like I should unpack each of the words in this sentence as I've chosen them very particularly. So let's start with myriad. Myriad just means a lot, a big variety, countless numbers. I think that tactical needs to have myriad choices available to those players, and there needs to be a lot of them. If there's only a few choices per turn, then there's not really a lot of opportunities for tactical play. For example, there's not that many move options in a game of checkers when you compare to something like Go, in which there are thousands of potential move options. The next word in this sentence is one of the most important ones, and it's viable. What do I mean by viable choices? Well, something is viable if it is actually something you could realistically choose and expect a good outcome or to have impact on the fight. Kind of like I was talking about with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, is you do have a lot of options available to you due to the complexity of its combat engine and all character options. But a lot of them aren't going to be viable at any given moment, especially if your build is over-specialized. Viable options means that there is actually something to weigh in your mind, something to try to optimize in the moment and combine with other things diegetically as you're playing. I'm going to lump the second half of the sentence together where I say that result in distinct outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have all of these different branching choices that you could do on your turn, all these different effects and abilities, but all of them basically result in the same thing, no matter which one you choose, well, those options aren't really distinct at the end of the day. They all do the same thing. And let me unpack what I mean by that. For example, in a game like D&D 5th Edition, the Player's Handbook, it describes that you could do various things narratively to try to gain advantage on a roll. You could work with the Dungeon Master to justify how you jump up on the table to get the high ground in a sword fight, maybe giving you advantage on the attack, or you swing from a chandelier and land behind them and now you have advantage because you've pulled off this stunt. All these different cool, potentially tactical choices you could make, but the way that the system actually resolves them is simply to give you advantage. At least that's how it's written in the book. And that sort of thinking is actually what a lot of people use to try to justify the Marshall-Caster divide in games like D&D, where they say, well, you just need to role play more in the scene and try to use the environment more to your benefit. But really, if all you're going to end up doing is like knocking the guy prone or getting advantage on a roll, all of these different branches and ideas you could have narratively in the scene really just result in the same thing at the end of the day. Those outcomes aren't particularly distinct. And this is exacerbated in a game whose primary conflict resolution is the exchange of hit points, an attrition-based conflict like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, where all of your different choices often just end up slightly changing how you dealt the damage you dealt. The actual outcome isn't all that different. It doesn't really matter if you did 10 damage or 14 damage at the end of the day. Those outcomes are very similar. Yes, doing more damage is technically different than doing less, but really that tactical choice there is fairly minor, and it's more of a question of optimization to do the most damage than it is making interesting tactical choices with distinct outcomes. Simply dealing damage in a slightly different way is not a distinct outcome. Now, looking at this definition, you might think, well, would a Rules-Lite game then be the most tactical because there is, in theory, infinite number of options available to you on your turn? It's really opened up. You don't play your character sheet. Instead, you problem solve in fiction, in the narrative, and then you and the GM work together to resolve it. Well, yes and no. And now is when I'm going to leverage a previous video I recorded a few weeks ago on GM-facing versus player-facing rules. This video digs into the concept of player agency and what real freedom is. Now, if you haven't watched that video, I recommend pausing this one and checking out that other one, and then coming back to this. I'll give you a brief definition of what I talk about there, but you may want to see the full unpacking of this concept. Long story short, I believe that freedom in a tabletop role-playing game has to do with what the player has agency over, what they can do without needing to get approval or validation from another person. And that's where those more prescripted and defined abilities help give the player agency. For example, it's not a negotiation between you and the Dungeon Master whether or not you can trip somebody with your weapon when you hit them in the leg when you're a Battle Master fighter with a trip maneuver. It's just something you get to do. You don't need to necessarily worry about whether or not the DM will resolve it in a way that's beneficial to you or the way that you would intend. And this is where a real push and pull starts to happen using this definition, as we wouldn't say that the more rules-light games are trying to be tactical in their rule structures, like a game like Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And I think real tactical gameplay actually lies in the middle. And I think Blades in the Dark does an interesting thing that we can learn from here when trying to do tactical play. Now, I'm not saying that Blades in the Dark is a game attempting to make tactical combat happen, it's definitely not. But the way it handles player agency when it comes to problem solving, I think is a good lesson to extract here. In Blades in the Dark, the players get to decide what is realistic or a viable option for problem solving. They get to put that forth without needing the GM to approve or deny it. Instead, all the GM does is set the difficulty that needs to be hit, or any complications that might occur. So in this way, the players still have agency over what they can do, and the GM is still responsible for the simulation and making sure that all processes realistically. It's these sort of lessons and middle ground that I tried to hit with Tales from Elsewhere, and let me explain my approach to this. In TFE, there is a baseline, concrete foundation that the rules are structured on. There are very clear and mathematically simple ways to resolve all the core things in the game. Shooting somebody with your revolver, knocking somebody over, lying to somebody, intimidating them, or diving for cover. There's just this baseline combat resolution that is pretty tactical to begin with. For example, there's called shots in Tales from Elsewhere. So if you attack and injure a limb, that limb is disabled by default. That's just a core rule, where if you hit something in the head or a vulnerable spot, the injury is more severe. That's just the baseline. You can always count on that. Additionally, because the math is so flat in Tales from Elsewhere, the difference between somebody who's not very good at something and somebody who's pretty darn good at something isn't so vast that even a layman can't attempt to pick up a revolver and take a shot at somebody and have a decent chance of success. And that foundation means that both the players and the storyteller are working off the same core resolution. It's already fairly fast and tactical and interesting and violent, but then on top of that are the improvisation rules. Now, saying improvisation rules may seem like a paradox, but really it's more about providing guidelines. So, for example, at the start of the section that talks about attacking people, pulling out your revolver and shooting them, or swinging a hatchet, or what have you, it goes into guidelines as to how to resolve attacks that aren't described here. If the players think of new ideas contextually, how the storyteller can adjudicate that. The guidance says, here's the ways that you can go about doing so, and provide some examples. If it seems like they're doing something more powerful than they can normally do, here's ways to add drawbacks to that. It's giving them scaffolding to build on that they could then use to have infinite variety within that space. Similarly, when it comes to the injuries that the weapons inflict, there's a concrete baseline here. The firearms will inflict bleeding injuries, or maybe a barbed arrow will be agonizing if it sticks in you. But then it also describes how to improvise new injuries, ways to do so, ways to balance it, so that you're not leaving the storyteller kind of out in the cold, as it were, on how to process this. You're building a scaffolding on which the players and the storyteller can build their infinite variety on top of, but they can always start with this concrete baseline. Let's wrap up this video with talking about the approach now that you can take to try to make sure that your game is more tactical than it is necessarily about mathematical system mastery. When you're designing your combat engine, make sure that what the players can do on a given turn is where the variety comes in, not necessarily all the different ways they could build their character. That system optimization outside of gameplay is all well and good and cool and fun and awesome. But that doesn't necessarily mean the players get to do a variety of different things on their turn with an individual character. And remember, those options you're giving the players need to be roughly viable with each other, right? They need to be actual choices, not trap choices or unoptimized choices. You want to make sure that your combat engine and the system that supports it don't invalidate options as characters become more specialized. You don't necessarily want characters to grow out of your tactical play via over-specialization. And remember that those different viable choices need to have distinct outcomes to them. If the players are simply picking between different ways to do 1d10 plus 2 damage, those aren't all that distinct in their outcomes. Small variations in damage output can add up over time, but aren't really representing a tactical choice. That's an optimization choice. They're not creating new decisions for the subsequent characters in the initiative order. They're simply attempting to expedite the conclusion of the fight rather than modify it via these choices. Because to the monster you're slaying, whether or not it took 12 damage or 18 damage does matter in expediting the conclusion of the fight, but it won't change the behavior of that enemy unless you hit certain maybe health breakpoints like with a bloodied system or so forth. It's not going to change what the next player in initiative does unless the monster actually changed, unless you've changed the parameters of the fight. And doing slightly more damage, it's not going to change the parameters much. I'm pretty happy with this definition here, that you need to have myriad viable options that create distinct outcomes. I think that's the real heart of what tactical play is. Now, I don't know if all of you are going to agree with that, and I'd actually love to hear whether you agree or disagree in the comments. Let me know if I'm way off base or if you agree. Posit your own definition that may be more accurate. Let's continue the conversation down in the comments or in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord server, which I'll also put a link down below. If you really want to dig into conversations, you can consider becoming a Tales from Elsewhere patron. The patrons get an additional video every week where I go through comments and unpack further information about the prior week's video. There'll be a link down below to the Patreon page if that's something interesting to you. Well, I think this video is going to be plenty long enough as it is, but I hope to see you next week on Tales from Elsewhere.